The heart is a divine dreamer, the god reclined upon the turning of time, conjuring existence through the deep breath of sleep, a world in a sigh. The heart is a divine dreamer, the sage who foresees all the stories we tell to demand passage beyond the gate of human limitation, the one who knows that beyond this raggedy fence is not glory or adventure or growth, but burnout, abyss. The heart is a divine dreamer, the self within the self who pours out the libation of rest, the self within the self who knows when to wake you with a kiss. Hello, dear hearts, and welcome to The Heart is a Cauldron, a podcast and Patreon community for healing through relationship with the animate world. I'm Kathryn, and I am, as always, so very grateful to be on this journey with you. Each episode is released around the new moon, and we explore the nature-based rhythms and energies of the month so we can more closely align our healing journeys within the magical webs we find ourselves part of. If you're listening after this particular lunation, fear not. Most of the themes are universal and timeless, and I hope these conversations will support you no matter when you happen to listen. Before we get into today's episode, I'm extending a tender request for your help. In order to continue this offering, I rely on the support of you and other listeners. If this podcast is nourishing to you, please help spread the word. I'm so touched by each and every share on Instagram or sweet message letting me know that your friend turned you on to this and you're sharing it in kind with your other friends. People have been posting about magical little synchronicities that happen after listening, or some fitting setting they happen to find themselves in while tuning in, or simply a favorite tidbit that rang especially true for them. It all means the world to me. And if you do share on Instagram, please tag me so I can say hello and thank you from the depths of my heart. Aside from sharing or leaving reviews, the other best way to support this work and enrich your own magical life is to join the Heart is a Cauldron Patreon, which unlocks beautiful guides, if I say so, for personal practice each month and other members-only content like live ceremonies and recorded meditations. And all Patreon proceeds from June and July will be matched by myself and given to 3 orgs committed to earth-honoring practices and decolonization. Lastly, please feel free to say hello or give me feedback. Connect with me on Instagram at kathryn.a.fink and look in the show notes for links to everything I just mentioned. Today's episode: the heart is a divine dreamer. Rest amid radiance. Here are the phases of today's dream to give you a sense of where we're headed. In part 1, we spend a moment reflecting on why the peak of summer is a perfect time to invoke rest. And we also explore what's going on in our mind-body systems when we rest and when we don't. In part 2 of this episode, I'll introduce specific healing allies for this lunation: the poppy, dreaming gods, and the creature that has been called both fluttermouse and bloodsucker. I do hope you'll find every bit of this episode beneficial, but as always, feel free to refer to the timestamps in the show notes if you'd like to visit a specific segment, either now or in the future. Part 1. Exploring seasonal energies of the animate world and aligning with these energies for our personal and collective healing journey. Today we find ourselves in the dizzying days of the lunar cycle for July 20th through August 19th. First, here's this month's window into the little patch of ecosystem I find myself in kinship with. Think of this as a page from my personal diary, in hopes that it inspires you to deepen your own engagement with the living world in your neck of the woods. The cicada killers have returned, as they do every year, their lumbering bodies bumping clumsily against my shins as I walk the garden path. Fearsome creatures for the cicada, who always arrive exactly 3 days later, but gentle giants to me. I enjoy their hypnotic hum for the brief few weeks they emerge. I savor too what I can of the heat this month, tracking the sensation of sweat beating beneath my breasts and eventually trickling down my body. I keep my hair off my shoulders to invite whatever cool I can. Echinacea drowsily bobs their head, and the air is thick sweet with the scent of their neighbor, hyssop. There's no wind. The smell seems instead to travel on the wings of the pollinators who tirelessly take advantage of these warm days. In the woods, the streams run low, revealing deer and coy wolf and turkey tracks along the muddy edges. And this lunation ends for me with one of the few days a year I return to Catholic Mass, clutching my first communion rosary and hand-picked bouquet of herbs and flowers and greens to lay at the feet of Mary and seek her blessing on this day of her Assumption, a day rooted in rich folk traditions as well. This year, though, I'll pray to her in the shade of the forest, under rafters of oak and birch, at the altar of the water's edge. Now, returning back to our more global conversation for this month. The energies unleashed at the summer solstice continue to unfurl this month and the next. Across much of the hemisphere, there are widening currents of ripening and maturing, the fulfillment of so many days of sun. Paying attention to this growth has long been essential to our survival, both in the human and more than human communities. Plants and animals need these precious days to add to their food stores in the form of things like fat or root systems. As humans, you can see this in some of the names for the moon or month in different cultures. Several Native American names for the August full moon reference corn and other essential foods such as rice, fruit, and sturgeon, the fish. This theme carries over in Europe as well, where August used to be called the month of wheat, or the large sickle, for example. We also see this, of course, in the harvest rituals that abound this lunation and the next. The fecundity and flourishing of this time comes as a byproduct of the heat that knits itself through the soil and settles heavily upon the surface of the earth. While this isn't the hottest month of the year in every part of the Northern Hemisphere, it's safe to say that many of us outside the tropics know well the special spell of these days, when, despite the radiance and call to fullness, we're often drawn to the shade, the respite of watering holes, the cool sides of rocks. In the Greco-Roman calendar, these are known as the dog days of summer, named so because of the appearance of Sirius in the constellation Canis Major, aka the Greater Dog. The dog days were blamed for not only the heat of this time, but lethargy as well, and even illness. As a child, I remember naturally aligning with the energies of this month, lazing about in the ramshackle fort I'd built with sticks, reading in the cool corners of libraries, and treading the water of the public pool all day long, only getting out when the mandatory break whistle sounded. Now, as an adult, I'm more inclined to follow the pool of our society's toxic worldview and feel like I must profit from these hot, sunny days, as if they were resources to extract and hoard ahead of the cold weather and longer nights. I also feel like this is the time of year when I should be producing my maximum output in terms of work, and honestly, even having fun. This tension seems to be playing out at a societal level as well. If ever there were a year for us as a collective to experience fatigue, 2020 is it. The extended isolation and anxieties of COVID, uncertainties around work, upheavals of family dynamics and routines, And of course, the huge and much needed tidal wave of effort around social justice. Much of this seemed to peak alongside the climax of the sun's energy leading up to the summer solstice. Widespread protests happened globally, the continued growth of COVID deaths, rising economic uncertainty. And as the summer tide rolls on, many people are thankfully still doing what they can to prevent the spread of COVID, and many continue to tend the liberatory fires that have been lit. But folks, let's just be honest, seem to be palpably worn down. Some are responding by trying to get back to a non-existent normal, which I understand that impulse. And some, especially the organizers and creative leaders in the social justice movement, are calling for a return to something more nourishing and satisfying than a false sense of normality. They're calling for the return of a devotion to rest. In our contemporary culture that's dissociated from the earth's rhythms, capitalism, racism, colonialism, they've all stripped us of our reverence for rest in favor of ever-increasing demands around productivity and worth as defined by output. And this impacts all of us. But many studies, of course, as well as the lived experience of countless people, tell us that folks in lower socioeconomic statuses are all the more vulnerable to cycles of stress. As Tricia Hersey of the NAP Ministry, which I'll reference again later in the podcast, explains, quote, "You can't talk about sleep deprivation or grind culture without talking about white supremacy," end quote. In the most recent heartbreaking example of this and how it disproportionately affects people of color, and especially those with other intersecting marginal identities, Angela Martinez Gómez, a trans woman of color, died after working with severe COVID symptoms for a week at her fast food job, while her managers allegedly brushed off her illness, outrageously blaming them on her hormone injections. If mainstream Western culture pushes against the need for rest, even in more extreme contexts like illness, it's no wonder that we have a hard time taking moments to replenish ourselves in our day-to-day lives. So I was curious to see what precedence there is for rites of rest among earth-honoring cultures, especially since so many folk traditions tend to revolve around the work that is required to survive, such as planting and harvesting, preparing medicines, tending livestock. While there are many examples of rest that exist after the harvest, post-childbirth, or in the colder months of the year, I was yearning to find traditions that occur prior to harvest, when work should hypothetically be at a climax. In these 3 examples I'm going to share with you now, forms of rest are not niceties, but are instead considered necessary for abundant futures. Among Finnish farming traditions, the second day of July has been called Hei Maija. Turnips, tobacco, and flax were sowed before and after this day, but on July 2nd itself, the fields were sacred. People were prohibited from entering the field in order to secure a bountiful harvest. In Bulgaria, highly ritualized and prescriptive methods of pause surrounded the sowing of the fields. After the first furrow was complete, it was important for the farmer to take a rest and ritually eat some bread, by first holding the bread aloft to encourage the wheat to grow tall, then breaking the loaf upon the plow or oxen yoke, dedicating the first bite to the sun and the field, burying that piece, then enjoying the rest between himself and the oxen. In some communities, a meal would also be shared with neighbors, and the wine and leftover bones from the meal were included in the offering to the earth. Finally, while the sowers completed their work, families at home would observe carefully a prohibition against many kinds of housework, such as sewing and sweeping, and visitors were not admitted. Another kind of prohibition ahead of the harvest is still practiced in Ghana among the Ga people. The Homowo festival, often held in August, is a time of feasting, processions, and parties. But for the month beforehand, there's a strict ban on singing, drumming, and other kinds of noisemaking. The roots of this practice lie in a time when the Ga faced a severe famine, which they eventually brought an end to through fasting and prayer. The contemporary month of quiet is meant to mimic and commemorate this communal act that finally brought the return of the harvest. As with so many aspects of our well-being, the lessons in nature's cycles and the science of earth-centered relationship are now being further illuminated in contemporary Western science. There are countless studies that attest to the necessity of rest for our mental, physical, and emotional well-being as humans. For example, we know now that downtime, whether that takes the form of things like naps or sleeping, sitting in a park, meditating, it's not just vital for our basic physical wellness, but fosters creativity, replenishes our brain stores of attention and motivation, and generally helps us show up as our best selves. Rest even facilitates how we process and store memories. This isn't so much because the brain and body just stop or shut down when we rest. In fact, the brain researcher Helen Immordino-Yang explains that, quote, resting the brain is anything but idle, and that far from being purposeless or unproductive, downtime is in fact essential to mental processes that affirm our identities, develop our understanding of human behavior, and instill an internal code of ethics, end quote. And probably my favorite prophet of rest echoes this very sentiment. Earlier, I briefly mentioned Tricia Hersey of the Nap Ministry, an organization that advocates for rest as a form of resistance against burnout culture and capitalism. As the organization's founder and nap bishop, Hersey preaches that rest is at the foundation of how we can regenerate the very heart of our communities. She creates collective nap experiences, leads workshops, and trains human rights activists, all centered on rest as a spiritual practice. Says Hersey, quote, I'm trying to reframe rest and deprogram people around the concept that if you aren't doing something in the classic sense, then you're not worthy. I want to uplift that when you're sleeping, you are actually doing something. You're honoring your body. You are giving your brain a moment to download new information. You're disrupting toxic systems. So, what's happening in our mind-body systems when we are denied rest or deny ourselves that rest? I've been reflecting back on lessons I've learned from my friend Dr. Pooja Amy Shah, who helped me understand stress and fatigue in a new way as one of the teachers in my meditation teacher training. It was the first time I'd heard about our allostatic load, which is basically the accumulated wear and tear on our minds and bodies as a result of repeated exposure to stress. Our bodies are incredibly wise and adaptive, and so when we encounter stress, we enter allostasis, a process where we release chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol to help us meet the stressor and get back to a less aroused state. Our body then relies on periods of recovery to replenish our ability to meet future challenges. But a high allostatic load, sometimes called allostatic overload, or as I just like to call it, overwhelm, is when we find ourselves chronically in states of stress and getting insufficient moments of recovery in return. The effects of this can be measured in the body and impacts things like our nervous system, digestion, heart health, immune response, and of course, emotional well-being. And so how do we cultivate more rest in our lives? How do we find space to pause, recuperate, and possibly even dream? Even when life seems to be in the most climactic moments of movement and expansion. And how do we do this in a way that doesn't require a full stop, but instead fuels our ability to be, to live, to persist? You probably know some of the most common prescriptions for this. More sleep, meditation, a supportive diet. It can also be helpful to understand what specific kind of rest we're needing. According to Dr. Saundra Dalton-smith, there are actually 7 types of rest to consider: physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, sensory, social, and creative. I really loved her free online quiz that she offers to help decipher which you might need most, so check out the show notes for that. And of course, I also certainly hope we heed the wisdom of Hersey and her nap ministry that I mentioned earlier and work together to advocate for wider cultural changes to support rest in really systemic ways. All that said, because of the mission of this podcast, today let's explore how an earth-affirming worldview can support our relationship to rest and recovery in service of not just our bodies, but our souls. And before we do, let's both take a moment to pause together. Here's a traditional Turkish lullaby, Sen bir Güzel Meleksin, which translates to, "You are a beautiful angel."
Sen bir güzel meleksin, her gönülde çiçeksin. Sen bir güzel meleksin, her gönülde dileksin. Sen ne şirin bebeksin, uyu, uyu. Göz bebeğim, uyu, uyu, ninni. Sen ne şirin bebeksin, uyu, uyu. Göz bebeğim, uyu, uyu, ninni. Şefkat tüten ocağım, açık sana kucağım. Şefkat tüten ocağım, açık sana kucağım. Ağlama yavrucağım, uyu, uyu. Göz bebeğim, uyu, uyu, ninni. Ağlama yavrucağım, uyu, uyu. Göz bebeğim, uyu, uyu, ninni.
In part 2 of each podcast episode, we visit with 3 teachers who can aid us in understanding today's themes. So today we're learning about sacred rest amid radiance from Poppy, dreaming gods, and a particularly beloved animal kin of mine, Bat. I've long treasured Poppy as a teacher of rest and radiance both, specifically in the summertime. The poppy seed is ever so tiny, but trusts in the becoming of something unbounded, something unfurled, something on fire. One day they riot into the world, skirts held aloft in a perpetual twirl, their faces held up to the sun teasingly to invite an open-mouthed kiss. Then, without sadness, without tarry, Poppy folds into themselves, into quiet, into a child's fistful of seeds, asleep and dreaming of being in the dark of the earth once again. Even in the height of summer, we need moments of pause to feel our own dreams inside us. What is that unspoken, hidden hope you're holding on to? Some form of poppy exists across Africa, Asia, Europe, Central America, and North America, and the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia were the first to mention the flower in writing around the time of 4000 BC. They called the opium poppy specifically the joy plant. Medicinally, poppy is related to rest in a number of ways, the first and probably most famously because of some poppy's role as a powerful painkiller and sedative. There are more than 24 alkaloids, form the basis for morphine, codeine, opium, and heroin. To the Egyptians, opium was a gift from the god Thoth, who instructed his servants on how to prepare it. From a famous Egyptian papyrus containing extensive medical knowledge from 1550 CBE, There is a, quote, remedy which the goddess Isis prepared for the god Ra to drive out the pains that are in his head. Berry of the coriander, berry of the poppy plant, wormwood, juniper, honey. When this remedy is used by him against all illness in the head and all sufferings and evils of any sort, he will become instantly well. End quote. Of course, poppy and sleep specifically have long been bedfellows. In just one historical example, the physicians of Midvey, a legendary family line of healers in Wales said to have served from the 1200s to the 1700s, prescribed infusing wine with the bruised heads of poppy to induce sleep. And poppies flower in the realm of the deepest sleep as well, death. Poppy ornamentation and the seeds themselves have been found repeatedly in Syrian and Egyptian tombs. But my favorite lesson from poppy is that this flower, so closely linked with sleep and rest and ease, dances just as closely with the magic of fertility. For the poppy, rest and abundance are inseparable. They speak of bounty and life through the milk they secrete from their body, the vast number of seeds that spill forth from every capsule, and the unbounded brilliance they bring to every field where they appear. The flower also blooms alongside many goddesses of fertility and agriculture in the Greco-Roman pantheon, and poppies can also be found carved into ancient Turkish representations of the tree of life. But it's not just visual language that connects poppy to fertility. Prior to industrial pesticides, poppies frequently grew alongside cereal grains, one of the reasons the flower is sometimes called a corn poppy or field poppy. Poppy is evidently well suited to thriving as an agricultural weed, in part because of, interestingly enough, their inclination towards rest, as well as their comfort with disruption. They establish long-lived soil banks of seeds that can remain dormant for long periods of time and then germinate when the soil is disturbed, making the conditions of tilled fields perfect for their long-term propagation. Poppy was so closely associated with important harvests that in England, people were discouraged from picking them during the month of August, for fear it would remove the poppy's protective magic upon the crops and bring ruinous storms to the fields. To sum up why poppy calls to me so much in lessons of rest and aliveness, I'll quote from the beloved Druid plant oracle deck. Quote, "Poppy unites the world of sleep and wakefulness, birth and death, in the way that it can act as a sedative and remain dormant for years, and yet, at the same time, appear bright red in the summer as a symbol of vigorous life." End quote. Poppies actually create a beautiful bridge to our next teacher, the divine dreamers. These are stories of deities who sleep as a mode of creation, and mortals who dream as a prerequisite to fulfilling their soul's purpose. For our first lesson, we turn to the Greek goddess of agriculture, Demeter, who bore sheaves of wheat and poppies in both hands. Most of us have heard the tale of how her beloved daughter, Persephone, was stolen away for several months of the year by Hades, god of the underworld. In most versions of the story, Demeter's rage and mourning result in winter. But in another telling, Demeter creates the poppy flower in order to sleep, find refuge from her grief, and then, rested and refreshed, awaken to welcome her daughter home by spreading spring across the land. From the poem by William Browne, who uses the Roman names, by the way. "Sleep bringing poppy, the ploughman late, not without cause to Ceres consecrate. Fairest Proserpine was rapt away, and she in plaints the night, in tears the day, had long time spent. When no high power could give her any redress, the poppy did relieve her. For eating of the seeds they sleep procured, and so beguiled those griefs she long endured." There are many, many myths linking sleep not just with the death and rebirth cycles like winter and spring, but with the creation of the world itself. In Hindu cosmology, The universe and our very existence in this moment is said to be a dream of a sleeping Vishnu, and when he eventually awakens, a cycle of creation ends. Among the Aboriginal people of Northern Australia, the Dreamtime Karora, an ancient deity, once lay sleeping in the earth. From Karora's own body springs bandicoots, a type of marsupial with which Karora satisfies his hunger. Then, dreaming once more, his body produces a bull roarer, an instrument that can be used for both music and long-distance communication. And this bull roarer becomes a young man who proceeds to dance around his father in the very first ceremony. In the last of the dreaming deities for today, the Abenaki of Turtle Island tell of the Great Spirit in a time of nothingness, before color, beauty, or even sound. The Great Spirit calls the Great Turtle to rise from the water to become the land, upon which the Great Spirit shapes mountains, valleys, and sky. He then becomes so deep in thought about the kinds of creatures that would inhabit this place that he becomes tired. While asleep, the Great Spirit has a dream of every type of insect, bird, fish, and other animals, including humans, and when he wakes, he realizes that his dream has become creation. But what about for us mortals? There are stories to point the way to the generative magic of our sleeping and dreaming too. In Turkish folktales about ashiks, a kind of bard, the call to their sacred vocation often begins with a dream that awakens them to action. And among the Abrahamic religions, an early story that spans Judaism, Islam, and Christianity is the dream of Jacob, patriarch of the Israelites, who stops while fleeing for his life to sleep and sees a ladder extending up to heaven, a prophetic vision with such profound implications for his descendants that there are many, many interpretations of its meaning, depending on the tradition. Lastly, one of the most widespread examples of mortals in sacred sleep is the cross-continental motif of the king beneath the mountain, where a heroic figure from times past, often a king and military genius, lies in a protracted sleep, awaiting the day when his people's need of him is the most dire, at which time he will awaken and come to save the day. Dozens of versions of this exist across Europe, and the most famous being that of King Arthur, who, after being mortally wounded in battle, is ferried by the sorceress Morgan to the magical Isle of Avalon, to be healed by its priestesses and safe kept in repose until the day of his return. While many more myths like this exist, I'll share just one more today. Among the Inca, their last great emperor, Atahualpa, is said to have vowed before his murder and execution by the Spanish colonizers that he would return to avenge his people. And this Inkari myth, as it is called, spread amongst indigenous groups, even as far away as Huiliche people of southern Chile. Deity or human, we all need rest in order to recover from our wounds, commune with our magic, and dream new futures. For today's last teacher, we turn, maybe surprisingly, to the bat, who flutters about on every continent aside from Antarctica. I have to confess that I have a sweet spot for these wonderful critters. First of all, they are queer AF. Many species of bat have been observed in homosexual sex, play, grooming, and even fellatio. I'm going to level with you. I tried hard to find a way to relate what I just shared to today's themes, but I couldn't. So the fact that I just snuck that tidbit in there was purely to help dismantle our often narrow and oppressive understanding of the natural world. And you're welcome. But in earnest now, how do we go from a mythic medicinal flower and dreams of creation and salvation to an often misunderstood and even reviled animal? Bats are, in my perspective, amazing ambassadors of the space between action and rest, day and night. There are a few facets to their being that have taught me this. To start, they're crepuscular, meaning that they're most active during the in-between time of twilight, the liminal space between day and night. I'll usually spot the dancing forms of the small brown bats who live in the siding above my garage just as the last blue-violet light seeps into the tree line. At dusk, the brown bat, the most common bat in Turtle Island or North America, will forage for about 1.5 to 3 hours, roost a while, then forage once more before dawn. Bats therefore know what it is to live in the balance. When they are awake and active, their productivity is prolific. But this is only because of the deep way in which they rest as well. Awake, the brown bat covers dozens of acres and consumes their weight and more in insects. The prize for this goes to females who are at peak lactation. In order to meet the needs of feeding their growing young, she'll consume 125% of her own body weight each evening. As for sleep, you might assume that I'd discuss the winter hibernation habits of many bats, but it's actually the brown bat's daily sleep regimen during the months they're awake, which I'll focus on today. The brown bat doesn't just sleep during the day. The brown bat enters torpor. Torpor is a state that helps certain mammals conserve energy. In the brown bat's case, by maintaining a lower body temperature and slowing their heart rate from 210 beats per minute to as few as 8 beats per minute. In fact, the bat's talent for stillness, hanging upside down, motionless, has even led to them being associated with longevity in Chinese art. Rest is so necessary for the bat that their populations are being threatened by an illness whose main symptom is waking up too early. White nose syndrome is a disease caused by a type of fungus which infects the skin and wings of many species of bat, causing them to wake up during winter, which in turn leads to burning up fat reserves they need to survive. According to the Center for Biological Diversity, white nose syndrome can kill 90 to 100% of affected hibernacula, or the caves used for hibernation. And the epidemic is regarded as, quote, the worst wildlife disease outbreak in North American history, showing no signs of slowing down, end quote. If, like me, you are grateful to the bat for everything they have to teach, you can check the show notes for ways you can help populations facing the white nose epidemic. Rest and radiance. We need them both. And this lunation is a perfect time to explore how you can invite each into your own life. This month or not, these 3 allies we've just visited can be teachers anytime we're feeling out of balance. They ask, what dreams are guiding your waking actions? What are your most deep-seated beliefs about rest? What would happen if your rest were as sumptuous and sacred and unique as your moments of movement, of flourishing? If you're yearning for more specific guidance on how to work with these themes in your personal healing and spiritual practice, you can access the monthly praxis guide for only a few dollars at the Heart is a Cauldron Patreon. Join before July, the end of July, I should say, and your Patreon subscription will also be matched by myself and given to 3 orgs committed to earth-honoring practices and decolonization. Thank you so much, dear heart, for joining me for this episode of The Heart is a Cauldron. As always, feel free to say hello or give me feedback. Connect with me on Instagram at kathryn.a.fink. And my heart goes with you in the between time.